Hey everybody, I'm Rosalyn Dennett, and welcome to Season 4 of Refocus. Each episode, I'm joined by incredible guests from all areas of the music industry for real and informative conversations with a focus on folk. Hello and welcome to Refocus. Our guest today is Andrew Karis. For over a decade, Andrew has worked to help recording artists understand and access the rights and royalties available to them in Canada and internationally. During his time with ACTRA RACS, he has held a variety of roles and now serves as Associate Director, overseeing the organization's day-to-day operations and supporting its ongoing service to performers. His broader experience in the music industry includes working with music union residuals, music supervision, event planning, and performing. Hello, Andrew. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good. Welcome to the show. We're going to get a little nerdy in this episode, maybe a little bit more technical than we might in some, because we're talking about performing rights, and specifically, I think in this case, neighboring rights. I'm wondering if you can start off by giving us an introduction to ACTRA RACS and what the organization does.
So ACTRA RACS is we're known as ACTRA RACS, but we're the Recording Artists Collecting Society. We are a division of ACTRA PRS, which is the Performing Rights Society, which is a division of ACTRA National, which is ACTRA is best known as the union representing, over around 30,000 audiovisual performers in Canada. So it acts primarily as a union, but there is a lot of lobbying efforts and advocacy that goes into the work that they do. And then the PRS side is sort of the side that handles residuals, both for sound recording performers and for audiovisual performers. On the audiovisual side, a lot of it is residuals related to collective bargaining, which is obviously a big component of unions. Mm-hmm. And then the royalties that flow from that are based on the exploitation of productions and through the collective agreements that exist. And then on the ACTRA RACS side, it's more based on copyright. So it's statutory rights that exist for all performers, in our case, for sound recording performers, but we do also pay audiovisual performers for the usages in other territories. There are no rights, copyright-based rights for audiovisual performers in Canada right now. So at ACTRA RACS, then we are paying sound recording performers for the use of their work. And when I say the use of their work, I mean if you hear a recording on the radio, or if you're in a bar or restaurant and you hear a recording played, it's those performers that actually, the musicians and vocalists, I should say, that actually record that music. It's those sounds that you hear. That's the value that is being added to the radio station or to the bar or restaurant, and we are ensuring that those performers receive a payment.
I appreciate that. And I'd love to dissect every piece of what you just said. Okay, maybe not every piece, but there's a couple of things I'd love to break down for anybody who's not familiar with some of the terminology there. So a couple of just like general terms that I find get used and are nice to explain. Something like exploitation, which like immediately I'm like, exploitation sounds bad. That's not a good thing. But in this case, it means something different. Can you explain what you mean when you say exploitation of somebody's work?
Yeah, that's a good distinction to make. I'm definitely using it interchangeably with used or usage. Mm-hmm. And it really just means someone's getting a benefit, often financial, from the use of the work. So in the case of like a radio station, for example, I mean, radio stations are kind of in the business of selling advertisements, right? And that we as listeners will listen to the radio station because we want to hear the music. But the money is made from radio station by ad revenues, right? So they're putting these ads on their station, then we're waiting for the music. So they're using that music to attract us as listeners to hear those ads. So that's kind of the exploitation in that instance. It's like that music is being used to draw in ads so that people can hear. So it's really just any kind of usage or for some kind of gain that's outside of its original purpose.
And that is different than new use?
Right. Yeah. I think by new use, you kind of mean like on the union side. So my understanding there is that a new use is based on a collective agreement, right? So that would be within the terms of the agreement. It's like being used maybe outside of or based purely on the collective agreement. Whereas in this case, it's affecting a right embedded in the Copyright Act. So the difference is when it comes to collective bargaining or collective agreements, that only covers those who are within that agreement. So in the case of unions, that's members. But when it comes to neighboring rights or copyright, any kind of royalties that SOCAN or that ACTRA RACS pays out, it's for everyone. So anyone at all whose performance can be heard, they are theoretically eligible to receive a payment.
Great. And I wanted to drill down a little bit into the neighboring rights. So, when we're talking about neighboring rights, it's different than the kind of copyright that might be held by the songwriter or by the label or by the master rights holder. Can you explain in a bit more detail about who are exactly the people that are eligible for this residual?
Yeah, that's a great question. I always like to think of it. I mean, we can talk about rights and, the Copyright Act, but it's really hard to translate that to everyday use. So I like to think about it in terms of what happens when a recording is made, right? What's your role? What did you do to help create that? And there's really four parts that I think of. There's the song and there's the recording, right? We know the song is the music and the lyrics. So that's one sort of right. And then there's publishers, right? They also are eligible for a payment through copyright. So that's the song side. That's, the SOCAN. That's the CMRRA when it comes to reproduction. And then you have the other side, which is the recording side. And that is everyone who performs in some capacity, both as a musician or a vocalist, and it can range from hand claps to, being a featured vocalist or being an orchestra member or whatever it is. We often joke that the takeaway from any kind of 101 is to become a professional hand clap artist because you can get paid many times on different recordings. So that's the one side, the performance, and the other side, as you mentioned, is the rights owner or the label. Typically, if you're a self-releasing artist, you would fall into that camp as well. You would be both a label and kind of an artist. So there's those four categories. For independent artists, I find it's very challenging because you're kind of doing all of them. You're the performer, you're the songwriter, you might be self-published, you might be self-releasing. But if you think more of session players or, maybe someone who's coming in just to sing a track, that's more where it's easier to isolate. Like if you're just doing the performance, you'd get no other royalties. So that's kind of what the neighboring right is for as far as performers go, to ensure that those performers are paid fairly when their music is used.
And so, can you let us know how, and you can be broad in terms of how, in general, different neighboring rights organizations operate, or maybe we can talk about specifically how ACTRA RACS distributes those royalties. Like, do you become a member? How do people become eligible to collect these neighboring rights?
So yeah, anyone who wants to collect in Canada, you typically registers with either ACTRA RACS or Artistes, who operates in Quebec. And again, it's really anyone who performs on a recording. So if you've ever released a recording, you can register. There's no fee. You can get set up that way. And then in terms of how we distribute that money, generally we pay 80% of royalties to what we call featured performers and 20% to non-featured performers. So featured performers are really anyone who is named on a recording and who is somehow selling that recording, so to speak. Like if you're in the title, you can be the primary members of a band, for example. You can be a guest artist who's featured in some way. And then the non-featured performers are really anybody else on the recording. And it can range from session players or, that hand clap artist that you're inviting into your session to do that work.
You're saying so 80% to the featured performers, 20% to non-featured performers, or maybe I'll call them supplementary or additional performers. Something like that on the track. Let's say you're a 4-piece band. Is that 80% split up between the 4 people versus if you were a solo artist, you would get that full 80%, and then the 20% is split up between each additional performer on the track?
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, we have a slightly different breakdown for classical music because obviously there are large numbers of performers in those groups. So it necessitates a slightly different split. But yeah, most of the distributions we make are based on that 80-20. And this is unique to Canada, just to clarify. So in other territories around the world, there are similar organizations like ours that we work with, and they would all have different splits based on, the policies that they've established in their country.
And so, as a Canadian performer, if I'm a member of ACTRA RACS, are you able to collect the international royalties if my song gets picked up and is being played as background music in a stadium in England? Are you collecting those royalties, or as the performer, would you have to sign up with a different international neighboring rights or performers' rights organization?
You don't have to. We have, arrangements with around 45 different organizations, covering most of the places in the world that have this right in place. And through that, we can collect any royalty that exists in that territory. So one interesting thing is, in Canada, there's a gap there. We don't have all the rights that they exist in other territories. So, as an example, performers in Spain and Germany receive a payment when their music is synced to TV or film. But that is not the case here. We don't have that right in Canada, but we do collect that from Germany or Spain. So if that usage is occurring there, we collect that on your behalf. So that's the great thing about that system. People can, if they like, they can register with every individual organization around the world. It's a lot of admin work, but it is something that some performers will do if they prefer to do that.
And then how do you get that information, or are people submitting that information to you? So if I know that my music was played in a usage, let's say in Canada, do you automatically also know this, or do I have to submit something to you to prove that this usage happened?
Yeah, we do get records. I mean, there's a requirement for users of music to provide details, we get those details from different sources. We work really closely with our friends at Resound, which is a licensing organization, and they are sort of the receiver of that data, and then they share it with the various organizations who are associated with Resound. But yeah, so we'll get playlist information related to, commercial radio, to CBC radio, to satellite radio, that sort of thing. And on that, that's how we base the distributions, where we see all this data that's, maybe an artist and a title. And then we use all the information that's been submitted to us by our members or by performers. And then we know which performers to pay based on that usage. And there's a lot of databases, internationally that we hook up to sort of enhance the data we have to, keep that process going.
Let's say an artist were to sign up today, but they've had a career, they hadn't signed up for neighboring rights before this, but they've done releases. Is there any residuals on past usages, or is it just like from the time you sign up moving forward?
Right now in Canada, we pay about 6 years back. So there's definitely, you can collect retroactively. It's really common. We actually went a lot further back until recently. So yeah, and the standard internationally is about 3 or 4 years, I would say. We're a bit longer here. But generally, I mean, we're just about to make our first distribution on 2024. So there's always a bit of a lag because we sort of get all that data and then have to do that processing. So yeah, we're always operating in kind of a retroactive nature. But yeah, there's right now 6 years. So if you're 2025? If you haven't signed up yet to any organization to collect and you had airplay in 2019, you got to hurry up.
Get in there. And so speaking of, choosing your neighboring rights organization, how many neighboring rights organizations are there? Who are they? And then can you explain a little bit about MROC and the closure of MROC and how that might affect clients of theirs or artists that were signed up with them?
Sure. Yeah. So currently there's effectively 4 organizations that kind of work in the neighboring rights ecosystem. On the label side, there's SOPROC. There used to be Connect, but they've sort of joined forces, I guess, as far as neighboring rights go. So they're kind of, if you're an independent label or you're a self-releasing artist, you would register with SOPROC. And then on the performer side, as I mentioned, there's ACTRA RACS and Artisty. And we work very closely together, but you would register with one or the other. And then, of course, there's Resound, who kind of acts as that middle space for the reception of radio data and the collection point. And, they do some advocacy on behalf of both labels and performers as well. So those are kind of the main 4, but you did mention, MROC used to be in that sphere. They're kind of one of the newer ones to arrive. They came about in, I think, around 2011, and they were kind of in the ecosystem for a while. Around April of last year, I think they announced that they were going to cease their operations at the end of the year. And yeah, I mean, they put out a public release, and I think it was just about the changing, effectively the changing rates and the diminishing royalties in the ecosystem, among other things. And so if you were a member of MROC, they gave options, which were, you could sign up with ACTRA RACS or another organization around the world if you chose. And if you did not choose, by the end of the year, your mandate would go to Artisty. So at the end of 2024, a large number of artists came to us at ACTRA RACS, and the remaining, which was also a very large number, moved over to Artisty. So if you're not aware of this, you most likely would be connected with Artisty at this point.
But you mentioned that Artisty, was that specifically Quebec? Or is it just Quebec-based and they serve all of Canada?
Quebec-based. I mean, I would say historically they've probably represented more French language artists, but there is crossover from both of us. There's not like a geographic line that we can't cross or something.
So you mentioned, with the closing of MROC, that they were seeing diminishing returns and diminished royalties coming in. Can you just speak to kind of the state of the sector in that way right now? Can we blame this all on streaming? What's going on, and why are we seeing these limited returns all of a sudden?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting, and it's a big question. I mean, for the most part, we're moving away from traditional broadcast, right? I don't think that's a secret, and it's not a revelation. I mean, streaming has really come to dominate the way that we interact with music. So that's kind of the first part. Like these existing commercial radio, satellite radio, those things are maybe not as popular as they were. And I think, the pandemic really exposed precarious nature of those formats. Like people weren't driving to work as much, so not turning on their AM, FM radio. That's kind of the first part. I mean, I think in Canada, we've been limited in what rights we've been able to acquire for performers. So I mentioned that sort of TV syncs. So, in some territories, they've established a strong rights framework to ensure that performers receive payments for when their recordings are synced to TV and film. That's one part. We all of us in Canada and then the neighboring rights ecosystem have been pushing for this for a long time, somewhat unsuccessfully. There's the private copying royalty structure, if people are familiar with that. So that's essentially, for a long time in Canada, if you imported blank CDs or blank media, a small levy would go to all the rights holders that were involved in music, so that not only on the recording side, but also the songwriter side, SOCAN and so forth. But we were never successful in extending that to newer forms of blank media, like iPods or iPods. Even iPods are old, but like iPhones and other devices where we copy a lot of music. So that's another area that's dried up. I think, in other territories around the world, there's a really strong collection on something called public performance, which is what I mentioned in earlier around like music played in bars and restaurants and that sort of thing. In Canada, for whatever reason, it has not reached the levels in other territories. So there's kind of a lot of factors going on, I think. Yeah, you kind of alluded to the streaming component. Like, there really are no rights to help performers get payments for streaming, right? And we've seen, as I said, we've seen the dominance of streaming in the last couple of years. And, to go back to the pandemic, again, it was this fascinating experiment where everyone had their livelihood removed, like a group of artists, performers, all artists really, who are precarious already, are now getting all that extra live income and so forth gone, right? And we see way more people listening to streaming. Streaming profits go way up, yet we're still hearing about artists doing very poorly, or like more poorly than they ever have before. So that, I think, really highlighted how bad that issue is.
Is there anything we can do? Are there like advocacy efforts, and are there campaigns?
The Burst Their Bubble campaign is a campaign we started to address, what we see as inequities for performers in the streaming ecosystem. So we've all heard stories about performers not being paid fairly. It's very common. So we wanted to try to start a conversation in Canada around how to improve that. And, the Burst Their Bubble comes from, it's partially like a reference to inflation, how everyone's making more money, performers, if anything, are making less, and that streaming services are declaring record profits. So we see the burst element of like, this is getting out of hand, right? We need to stop this. And really, we've seen internationally some organizations like ours who've had effective campaigns like this and have managed to affect change in their country and establish new rights. So we're hoping to do something similar here. But, as far as our campaign, we've been getting feedback from artists for a long time. And a lot of it is like, we don't know where to start. How do we raise this issue? So we decided it's something that we can take on because we represent recorded artists. The feedback since we've started it, which has only been a couple months, the feedback has been incredible. But we really want to start a conversation. We want the performer community and the industry at large to sort of, address this issue. And we started a letter campaign that you can sign up. It's at bursttheirbubble.ca. And, you can just sign up, and it essentially sends a call to action to your MP. And it also puts you on our mailing list where we're providing updates on the campaign and where we're going. So our first sort of couple months on this campaign was to raise awareness and to just get some engagement which has been excellent. I mean, we've had a lot of the general public sign on to this, which has been very fascinating. So it seems like there's an appetite from the general public to be like, why aren't performers getting paid fairly for streaming? Like, this doesn't make sense, which we were very surprised by. We're kind of moving into the phase where we sort of engage the industry more. Like, we've been chatting with a lot of artists who are very interested in sort of raising their voices on this issue. And I think for us, it's really just applying pressure and trying to continue that conversation. We saw this happen in other territories. So in England, or the UK, I should say, a couple of years ago, there was a big movement there called the Broken Record Campaign, which is kind of around a similar issue, where a lot of artists were standing up and talking about how they're not getting any money from streaming. There's a great story, actually, that I saw recently around a classical artist who I think is a violinist who played on Amy Winehouse's Back in Black and started an Instagram story about it where she's essentially said, I've made $20 off this recording, which is wild, right? It's very depressing. And it really reminds me in a lot of ways of like how things were in the 90s before this neighboring right existed. ACTRA and the AFM and a lot of other UDA in Quebec, a lot of organizations representing performers really had to do a lot of lobbying to bring neighboring rights into Canada. It feels like a bit of a similar story now where it's like this other structure is starting to diminish and we don't have a framework for how we move forward. So yeah, we've seen these great things happen internationally. In Spain in particular, they have a right in place essentially requires streaming services to pay CMOs directly representing performers. So it's sort of a new right that occurs after you release music effectively, or your music is you somehow attach your performance to a recording. And that has resulted in a lot of payments. I mean, we get payments from Spain for artists we represent, which is directly from, Spotify, from Apple Music and so forth. And what that does is it also gives performers sort of a direct route to be able to negotiate with streaming services, which they don't really have now. I mean, right now it's you kind of assign your rights to a record label, which is fine, that's a valid process. Or as a self-releasing artist, you're given this one rate from the Spotifys or the TikToks or whatever it is. But, having that other right exist would allow this negotiation to occur and would give performers and the performer community more agency, I think, over how they are remunerated.
Where do people go to find that campaign?
Burstthirbubble.ca. You can also go to the racs.actra.ca website. We have like an advocacy section and, we sort of talk about the streaming campaign there, and we have a link out to burstthirbubble.ca.
I'll urge anybody who's listening to the podcast we'll link to all that stuff in the show notes. You can go there. But if you're listening on the radio, A, thank you for listening to radio still. B, anybody can sign on, and this is a non-partisan issue. This is, just getting, money into the hands of musicians and the people who make the music you love. So I encourage everyone to go check that out. Andrew, if people are interested in signing up and becoming a member of ACTRA RACS, how do they do that? Where do they go?
Yeah, great question. Again, it's just going straight to our website, racs.actra.ca. I mean, there's a button that's like sign up now. That's the easiest way to do it. You can always just send us an email too, or we still use phones, so you can call us. I find this is always advice I enjoy giving because people forget that, we're a not-for-profit organization. We're here to service members. So we really are open to any questions. I think this goes for all the not-for-profits in Canada. And I'm sometimes surprised that people don't reach out more, but yeah, just, shoot us an email. We're happy to walk you through the process or set up a meeting or something. So.
Yeah, and I'll amplify that just from my own experience working with neighboring rights organizations as a performer. I've always been really impressed with like just the accessibility, like you mentioned. Really, you can call these are, it's not a nameless, faceless organization. This is a not-for-profit with people who care about getting money into your hands. So yeah, I really encourage that if you haven't signed up with a neighboring rights organization, do check out ACTRA RACS, check out other ones out there, shop around if you want to, but certainly I can vouch for the care that you guys put into your membership and doing what you do. So Andrew, it's been a pleasure chatting with you. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.
That's all for this episode, friends. The Refocus podcast is an original production by Folk Canada. Find out more by heading to folkcanada.com/refocus. That's REFOLKUS. The podcast is produced by Kayla Nizon and Rosalyn Dennett and mixed by Jordan Moore at the Pod Cabin. The opening theme is written and performed by King Cardiac, and the artwork is by Jamie Karn. Please give us a download, subscribe, rate, and review to let us know you care, and follow us at folk_Canada on Instagram to submit your questions.